Welcome back to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies, and welcome to this deep dive series that we're calling Network Nation, where we want to try to reimagine community, diaspora, and homeland after COVID and after the war. And let me explain that I'm using the term homeland as shorthand because I don't want to keep repeating that I really mean Armenia and Artsakh. And of course, in all diaspora discussions about any diaspora, it's also true that homeland, any homeland, is often not recognized as that, so much as being recognized as a country of origin. So in the Armenian case, for example, second, third, fifth generations living in diaspora, for them this maybe is not a country of origin, but a homeland nevertheless. So it's a complicated term, but it's shorthand. This is episode 2 of this series, and we're calling this episode Knowledge Nation. In the first episode, which you can find online anywhere, YouTube, Facebook, the Institute site, armenian.usc.edu, you can also find the audio version as part of the Unpacking Armenian Studies podcasts. In that first episode, we spoke about the aftermath of the two crises and the continuing crisis in that aftermath. With Knowledge Nation, we want to ask, what do Armenians need to know in order to be able to move beyond these two crises? What was learned? What needs to be asked? But in order to navigate beyond these crises, it's also important to recognize that the homeland, Armenia and Artsakh, are also facing 3 other major crises, each of which must also be explored, understood, tackled, resolved, or at least on the path to resolution, if homeland and diaspora are to chart new courses that will lead to improved lives. The 3 crises? Well, of course, there's the crisis of security, both physical and psychological. There's the crisis of environmental safety and security in Armenia and in Artsakh. And there's a demographic crisis that can't be understated and that impacts everything. So as you listen to me, you might as well say, well, I could have called this episode Crisis Nation as well. But we didn't, because underlying today's discussions, first about these 3 crises, then more globally on lessons to be learned, conclusions to be drawn, questions to be asked, all leading, hopefully, to policies to be formed. Underlying all of these is a fundamental understanding that there is so much that is not known that must be learned in order to travel down this trajectory from crisis nation to network nation, which is how we want to end this series in a few weeks. Knowledge Nation, digging, exploring, learning more about the present and the past in order to build a future. That's the premise. And to have this conversation today, not only will we welcome back in a minute Dr. Viken Cheterian, but also we will welcome 3 individuals to speak about the crises from the ground in Armenia and Artsakh. Armine Aleksanyan, who is Deputy Foreign Minister of Artsakh, Tsovinar Harutyunyan, who is the head of office of the United Nations Population Fund in Armenia, and Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan, a political scientist, a climate negotiator. In addition, we have 2 public intellectuals at 2 ends of a spectrum. The first is Rich Elmoyan, who is a social media personality and Instagram presenter. I'm not quite sure what the terms are anymore, but who has used this crisis to share knowledge in new and timely and urgent ways. And at the very end of this conversation, but hopefully a conversation you will wait and follow, is a conversation with Professor Khachig Tololyan, who is known the world over as one of the founders of the field of diaspora studies, not just Armenian diaspora studies. So that's what we have to look forward to today, and I hope you'll stay with us, and I hope you'll share and ask others to join as well. First, let me welcome back Dr. Viken Cheteryan, who is a professor in Geneva at the University of Geneva, as well as at Webster University in Geneva. Viken, you're in Armenia. And we're welcome
Yes,
to...
good evening.
We are ready to welcome you here, but also let me please welcome our first guest, Armine Aleksanyan, Deputy Foreign Minister of Artsakh, who of course will talk about the crisis of security, both physical and psychological. So welcome Viken Cheteryan, welcome Armine Aleksanyan.
Thank you, good evening.
Good evening to you, Armine. Good evening to you, Viken. Viken, you're not just in Yerevan, you're at CivilNet. Tell us what it feels like to be on the ground, because obviously that's what I'm going to ask Armine in a minute.
Yes, good evening from Yerevan. So it was a strange day today, lots of rumors. We don't know what's happening on the border with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani soldiers who penetrated Sulik some days back. So there are lots of rumors. There were airplanes in the sky of Yerevan. So the atmosphere is very electrified.
And when you say we don't know what's going on, it's because the discussion is all informal and there's no formal conversation?
There's lack of information coming from official sources, but also there's lack of trust because officials have communicated different things different times, contradicting information coming from the different departments of the state of Armenia here. So all this creates, after the war and after the disaster of communication during the war period, there's lots of mistrust and feeling of insecurity here.
Well, if that's not a perfect introduction of the questions that we would like to talk about with Armine Aleksanyan. Armine, you're in Stepanakert. Thank you again for being available to us and to our audience. You did it during the war, and it was appreciated. I don't know how to say that enough. This issue of insecurity, psychological insecurity, lack of trust, where do you want to begin? How do we tackle this? How do we understand it?
Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Well, insecurity, I mean, as understood from Stepanakert, as Vigen has rightly noted, I mean, double that insecurities and you will get the situation in Stepanakert, because here it's not just rumors, but here it's also concerns. Connected also as of recent events taking place in Sunik, because everyone in Stepanakert understands that the infrastructure security is also of major concern when it comes to the only road connecting Artsakh to Armenia. So as if the existing on-the-ground securities were not enough, this new dimension has come to actually create more tension in an already tense surroundings, if I may say so. But of course, most of all, it's the physical security as felt by regular people in Karabakh. In some villages more so, because they're very, I mean, most of our settlements now are in a very close proximity to the Azerbaijani soldiers. Before, we only had two bordering villages. Now, most of Karabakh is borderline, if we can put it that way. And every day something is happening. Maybe not a major, large-scale security threat, but something that actually triggers many questions with regards to physical security, as well as the psychological, the perception of that very security atmosphere that is in Karabakh. Again, the same way, because there is not enough credible information coming. People, each of them basically base their perceptions, their worries over what they hear from different parts, or from the parts that from where they have heard about something. They call their relatives, ask, is it true that there was this problem, or is it not true?
Yeah, the informal
so it's very
structures.
real. Exactly. But also, I mean, added to this, there are such security concerns as mines, cluster munitions that are still there. As I said, roads, you never know. I mean, there were accidents whereby cars were being stoned at, a tractor working in the field was being fired at. Today, some shots were, according to some information again, shots were fired in the direction of Karmir Shuka village. So basically, every day you hear those things, and you cannot really clarify what. I mean, everyone understands that most probably there will be no large-scale escalation, at least for the coming 4.5 years. But at the same time, no one is really sure how their physical security is going to be guaranteed, because compared to pre-war situation, of course, every Artsakh, every Armenian knew that the main and sole guarantor of Artsakh's security is its army. Today, situation has changed. The security provider is not only the army, but in some parts, especially the corridor connecting Armenia to Karabakh are the Russian peacekeepers. So, I mean, and there's so many uncertainties, information-wise, I don't know, not only information-wise, but actually people are asking each other a question. What is next? What is going to happen to us? Today, when we heard about the situation in Syunik and, you know, everyone was worried, people started asking, so where is, you think we'll need to go to the bunkers again? You know, these are the topics that are everyday talk. And I think if we want to get out of this crisis, we should really find a way of introducing some clarity on the information front, on the other fronts as well. I mean, giving the regular people information about what steps, what measures are being taken to avoid the security threats, security risks, how we're going to manage these risks. Because the vacuum of information creates place for all sorts of uncredible information to come in and fill that vacuum and create all sorts of analysis and ramifications stemming from that.
False or
and
not.
I don't think that is something, yeah, which also brings to, I mean, there are other dimensions of security that we face on a daily basis. For example, recently there was I mean, in some parts of the town for a day, in other parts for 3 days, there was a lack of water. Because of the rains, some canals were being filled up with too much
blocked with leaves
blocked,
and debris.
And it took a while to actually negotiate and be able to physically reach that spot and clear the blockage so that the town can get water. If we take again, and I don't want to go very much into environmental security because I'm sure that Irina will be speaking about it in more detail, but if we consider the fact that water sources, all of them mostly that feed Karabakh, I mean, irrigation plus potable water, all of those sources are located in Karvajar area. Now it's not under our control, and basically anything can happen. We cannot really, many people in Stepanakert started buying only bottled water because they're afraid that the water could be contaminated. And you cannot really, I mean, these are the things that are still very fresh.
I want to say now, because I will forget to say it later, that as we planned this program, we were very aware that talking about each of these fundamental issues for 10, 12 minutes is both wonderful because it needs to be done and terrible because it does a disservice to the topic and the person. So I want to say to our viewers and our listeners that each of these topics will become the theme of a regular hour-long podcast on unpacking Armenian studies so that we can really delve into them in ways that are clearer, more detailed, more comprehensible and possibly more actionable. So Armine, thank you for doing that much in the 3-4 minutes you had. Viken, do you want to jump in? Because I really want to pursue this issue of clarity.
Yes, I would like to ask a question concerning Artsakh's future diplomacy. Now we are 6 months after the war. Do you have proactive diplomatic approach to address all these concerns that you have raised? Security, water issues, infrastructure, communication roads. Do you have a way to address these things through diplomacy, through diplomatic channels?
And the continuation of that question is building on last week's episode where your boss, the foreign minister, spoke about the need to make clear that Karabakh, Artsakh needs to be an agent in these processes, not just the object of these processes. And so the natural question is, how is that doable if in the past there were understandable, clear channels of responsibility and communication between Yerevan and Stepanakert? What's the situation now?
Actually, Vigen's question brings me to the issue of political security, because in order for a state to politically secure the aims that is pursuing in diplomatic field or elsewhere, it needs to use the international mechanism of there. When it comes to the cooperation between Armenia and Artsakh on these issues, I am glad to mention that between the ministers of foreign affairs, at least, this cooperation is still in place, and we use the Armenian Foreign Ministry channel to actually send our messages concerning water situation, concerning housing rights of the forcibly evicted population of Artsakh, concerning the right to clean potable water, the rights of refugees or forcibly displaced, the rights of children who are forcibly displaced and deprived of the right to education, the right to better healthcare, etc., etc. So basically, we are doing everything possible to make these issues on the focus of the international organizations as well as on bilateral level, including the most pressing issue, which is the issue of POWs as well. And in the European Parliament today, there was a motion for resolution set to specifically address this issue as well. So in that sense, when it comes to diplomatic targeting, we're doing it the same way, but maybe with more frequency and pressure. But unfortunately, I have to say that international agencies like UN and UN specialized agencies, after 6 months of the ceasefire, have been unable to actually do anything when it comes to Karabakh. Of course, they've been providing some aid to the displaced people who are refugees in Armenia. But I have to say that even though there were attempts made to bring a mission, UN inter-agency mission to Nagorno-Karabakh, it didn't happen because of Azerbaijan's inconstructive stance. The same goes for other international organizations like Council of Europe, European Parliament. All of them, even when they come to Armenia, they don't want the EU representative for the crisis in Georgia and South Caucasus conflict, the Council of Europe rapporteur on humanitarian consequences of the conflict, none of them can visit Artsakh. And I think that it is something that is ridiculous and maybe should be addressed. And that's where maybe we need also the pressure from the diaspora, because we have to understand that in the new reality, whereby we're not as free, we're not as independent as we used to be, there are certain limitations to our capabilities, and also in the information sphere, sometimes we may not be able to voice certain issues, and we may need diaspora to do it on our behalf. Because now we have to consider not only the insecurity it may cause to Armenia, but also some issues that may have a negative impact on our very security via the peacekeeping forces. So we really have to be careful in how we package our messages when speaking to the outside sources, and where we cannot be very vocal about certain issues. As a network nation, if we manage to become one and not act separately, each in our own geographical corners, be it Stepanakert, Yerevan, LA, or Geneva, if you wish, then maybe we'll be able to give roles to delegate certain tasks according to their doability, if I may put it that way. And also we should work from inside and outside to make sure that when diaspora can do something, the homeland, meaning Armenia and Artsakh, can perceive it and utilize it in the manner that will serve to the benefit of the nation and will create added value to this action. In other words, we should be concentrating on not doing something for the sake of doing it, for the sake of looking good, for the sake of looking caring, but we actually should do things that can be life changers, even if it means for some diasporans actually moving to Artsakh and Armenia and working directly from there, because there is the precedent of Israel, whereby after 1973 war, a huge migration to the country basically saved it, because it solves a number of issues, not only demographic crisis, but also economic isolation crisis, all the crises that come with the physical security, with the existential security, because they're all complementing each other. And I think diaspora should really start thinking in that direction, not only sitting and getting worried and trying to organize conferences. And I'm not blaming anyone for anything here, but I'm just trying to say that maybe we should think beyond that and think of something that can create action, irrespective of how we call it, whether we call it Artsakh, Armenia, diaspora, Trinity, we call it unity, doesn't matter how we call it. It's the action that will matter and will bring change.
I wouldn't dare try to ask a question or add anything to that. So, Armine Aleksanyan, I think you've laid out the very basics as clearly as possible. The link from crisis nation to network nation, going through knowledge nation, because otherwise one needs to know these in order to act upon them. So I want to thank you again and always, and to promise that we will continue this conversation via podcast, because you've hit every nail on the head. So thank you again.
Welcome.
I want to thank Armine, but I also want to apologize to Armine and to all of you. This is short, but I think that we need to do it, and we need to really hear each of these crises in order to be able to create the formulas for trying to move forward. So Viken Chateryan, of course, will continue with us on this conversation, and I want to welcome Tsovinar Harutyunyan, who has worked in the sphere of human rights, gender rights, and of course population and demographics issues since the early 2000s. She heads the United Nations Population Fund Office, UNFPA, in Armenia, and she is a great deliverer of the next message, that is the conversation about the demographic crisis. And it truly is a crisis, not just in the ways in which we think about it, in terms of gender selective abortions or in terms of outmigration, but really far more complex than that, which means far more points of action. So welcome back, Viken Chateryan, and please welcome Tsovinar Harutyunyan.
Hello, colleagues. Nice to be with
Thank you. Thank you, Tsovinar-jan. Tsovinar, you heard Armine, and you saw how hard it is to do this in the 15 or so minutes we have. But we've spoken off camera about the 4 points of crises that you, your office, and Armenian leadership must deal with. Could you talk about them with us, please?
Thank you, Selvi. Indeed, population crisis is one of the multiple crises that unfortunately Armenia is currently facing. And population crisis is not only interlinked with all other crises, but I strongly believe that it is baseline factor on the one side and, as you said, impacting factor all other processes on the other side. So Armenia has been facing population decline since independence. This means that the absolute numbers of people living in Armenia has been declining. So the major reason was high out-migration. Other major reasons were low fertility, declining number of births, mortality, and also there were some additional issues like high infertility and prenatal sex selection.
So one more time.
Right.
The huge out-migration at the beginning of the 90s and continuing.
Yes.
The low fertility.
Yes, and declining number of births, mortality, especially connected to COVID and recent war, as well as we have other additional issues like prenatal sex selection and high infertility. So let me unfold them so it would be clear. Since early 90s, over more than 1 million people have left Armenia. The fertility rate has been declined by 40% and dropped below simple reproduction level. And the number of births has been decreased for more than twice. Like we had 80,000 births yearly. Recently, we had approximately 36,000 births. Despite the positive balance of births and deaths in Armenia, which is so-called natural population growth, Armenian population has declined from 3.5 million to 3 million, like less than even 3 million within the 30 years of independence. And it will continue to decline according to UN projections. And very sadly, war and COVID seriously affected this difference between births and deaths.
What are those numbers?
In 2020, our natural growth composed a little bit higher than 1,000, which is 54 times lower than it used to be at the beginning of our independence. And moreover, for the first time in Armenian modern history, we recorded the increase of deaths versus to births in all regions of Armenia except Gevarkunik and Yerevan. And the situation is worse in rural areas because it is interesting phenomenon to see that since 2012 our fertility rate has been declined and it is lower now in rural areas than in urban areas. This is unheard. So the general rule in the world is that it is higher in rural areas. Let me come to the second biggest issue, which is high out migration, and related with COVID and post-war, we think that potential new wave can be very dangerous for Armenia, and we should tackle it from short-term and mid-term perspective. And if it does take place in a relatively comparable size like we had in 90s, then consequences can be really disastrous and it can affect on all spheres of our life: security, economy, social, health, education. And unfortunately today there are drivers of it, like for example, endless uncertainty that we have after war.
Say that again.
Sharpened uncertainty, post-war uncertainty, anticipation of new escalation and continuous like regular escalations as we see, and sharply worsened socioeconomic situation. And in general, so when there is high out migration and low births, nations think that this will lead to smaller, weaker and older nations. And on the top of all this, in Armenia, population aging is a reality. And
say that again, because I think that last one is one that we rarely think about. And Tsovinar, your internet speed has really decreased, So it's a little bit hard to understand you. That's why I keep interrupting. So talk about aging, please.
So aging is a very, very serious problem now that we face, which adds burden to the state regarding its social security and impacting our economy. Because when we look at our projections, we will see that in 30 years, 30% of our population will be over 60, and 24% of our population will be 65 plus, which means that 1 in each 4 in our society would be 65 plus. And these people is my generation. Actually, they are today's decision and policy makers. And if we look at the dependency ratio, which is the ratio of working age population to 65 plus population, we will see that it used to be 11 to 1. Now it is 5 to 1. In few years, it will be 3 to 1, which means that 3 people will take care of 1 elderly person. Just think about this.
Tsovinar, before I throw this to Viken, well, maybe I'll throw it to Viken first, but before we end this segment, I think it's really important for you to talk about all of the efforts at addressing some of these, you know, the knee-jerk, well, we need to do this and we need to do this, including, you know, multiple child families and all, and why some of that is faulty, and also the long-term effect of gender-based abortions. But Viken, I want to throw it to you first if you want.
Tsovinar, my question is the following. We know these trends since the 1990s, right? That Armenia has this demographic problem. Armenia is not alone. There's a number of post-Soviet countries that face similar demographic challenge. Georgia is one. Moldova is another one. Ukraine is very important. It went down from around 52 million at the moment of its independence to 42 million at, if I'm not mistaken, at the current stage. My question is, I always thought that a small country like Armenia will be able to manage these problems because the scale is smaller. And for a country like Ukraine, where the scales of the problems are so much more challenging, it's more difficult. Is it the case? Is a small country like Armenia able to face these kind of challenges or not?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very, very good question. Actually, I think that yes, we can turn demographic crisis and demographic change into opportunity, because there is opportunity in any crisis, in any change. And there is no need to invent the wheel. Actually, there are best practices, lessons learned from a lot of countries, from Eastern Europe and Central Europe as well, because they also face similar problems. Actually, in today's world, what matters more is not the numbers, but what matters ultimately are the skills, health, and talents of people, human capital of population, their education, productivity, and innovative potential. And if we can create such an environment when young people will have confidence in their future, when women can participate in all spheres of our life without having to give up childbearing, when old people's potential will be valued and fulfilled, countries like very small countries like Armenia can grow not only in numbers but also in quality, prosperity, and stability. What we suggest, so first of all, we have to address potential wave of migration, and we have to address internal migration, which empties our borderline communities. Because when we talk about demographic issues, the first thing come to people's mind is let's tackle fertility and let's increase fertility. I would argue that increasing fertility is very, very difficult, and only very few and very rich countries in the world, like Sweden and France, managed to increase it just a little bit. And I would say that in our reality, it would be almost impossible, because in few years, in 4 or 5 years, the generation of 2000 and 2001 too will enter into active reproductive age, and they would lead reproductive role of the country. And we know that this cohort was the smallest in our modern history. And very unfortunately, their cohort became even smaller because of the war, because conscripts were mainly from this generation. And there are a lot of other factors as well, like the age of getting into marriage or becoming a mother. It has been steadily increasing during recent years, and this is the tendency in Europe as well. And we cannot do anything to revert this tendency because our lifestyles have been changed drastically, and it's changing every day. Like we had also high rate of divorces and a lot of other problems. But for long term, as Salpi said, we have to provide our families full packages, not targeting one or two problems, like for example, fertility. So what needs to be done is stable jobs with decent salaries, affordable housing, affordable, quality, accessible, free of charge childcare services, ability to balance and combine family and career, as well as like long-term benefits, tax benefits to our families. This is a strategy for long-term approach. As it comes to short and mid-term approach, we think that first of all, we have to build trust in our country, to build confidence so that people who live here see their and their children's future in our country. And here, all people have task in this. So it's a task for government, for media, for business sector, for civil society, for extraordinary people, professionals, intellectuals like you guys and international organizations, of course. And it is a task for diaspora too. So first of all, I think that diaspora should also trust in our country and trust people who live in Armenia. And maybe we have to think of new approaches, as Armine mentioned correctly. We have to trust each other. We have to work together and to learn from each other. And so using this opportunity, I would like to ask what diaspora needs so that they can be more involved in trust building and confidence building of our country.
Viken, if you want to continue, please do. Otherwise, I'm going to ask two very specific questions before we thank Tsovinar.
Yes, very quickly. Those issues were thematized by the current government after the 2018 political events. Did you see any concrete policies to address the demographic issue? Did we take the right steps from your perspective? Did the government do learn from other experiences in Eastern Europe and post-Soviet?
Yes, actually a lot has been done during recent years. The most important thing is there is commitment on the side of the government, and they take it as one of their top priorities. So the Demographic Council has been established under the Prime Minister. This is a very important signal that they take issues very seriously. So we started to look at the issue from a holistic, comprehensive approach. Because, as I said, this is not a task of just one ministry. And a lot of programs has been started already and have been entered into force since July last year. So we had programs on better housing conditions, increasing child allowances, etc. It's too early still to measure the impact of these policies. But as country faces a lot of external challenges, internal challenges, there are not enough resources to put in this and to tackle and have a holistic approach. But I think that we are in the right direction. So the situation has been presented to the government. They know very well what is going on. International experience has been examined, and we have already started to implement few family-friendly policies. And I think that we will do it in a scale-up mode very soon as we fix the security issues in our country.
Tsovinar, so much of what you've talked about, and you keep using the word trust. You are now the third person in half an hour. You know, Armine said it, Viken said it at the top. So in this process of building trust, my line has always been, without information, without solid information, no trust, no hope, no policy development, no movement forward. In the issue of gender-based abortion, gender-selective abortion, the recent reports have been that Armenia has improved. And my question is, what are the points that lead to success if this improvement is a success? What can we point to and say, look, here are mechanisms proven, used, possible, and we can use them for all of these other issues as well, as including life balance, career mothering, including attitude towards aging, including educating for an aging population, and on and on. All of the problems you mentioned. What's worked?
Yeah. Sex-selective abortions actually is a very good example to show what approach work. In this case, actually, it was UNFPA who identified that this phenomenon exists in Armenia. Years back, we noticed that there was imbalance between newborns, boys and girls, but we didn't know that there is such kind of phenomenon, what is it, and what are the reasons. So the most important thing is identification of the issue and very well analysis of issue and making comparisons and looking for advice, looking like in the world, see whether someone faced with this problem and what actions they have taken. But it is very important not to copy-paste this problem. And then, of course, we started with research. We did a lot of research. We had evidence-based and we had projections. We found out that only as a result of this phenomenon, until 2060, 93,000 girls will not be born in Armenia, which is more than 2.5 years of births, yearly births in Armenia. And as a result of this, our population will be declined by 80,000. And this is really luxury, like a country, like a small country like Armenia. So again, holistic approach is key. We have to advocate, we have to talk, we have to combine our efforts, we have to work with social workers, health workers, media, youth, everyone. And as a result, we have this slight positive change.
Thank you. I apologize for interrupting, but that's what I do. Thank you very much. And as promised, we will continue this conversation via a podcast because it is possibly the crises of crises. Thank you, Tsovinar Harutyunyan. And now I'm going to welcome Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan, political scientist, climate negotiator, author of Post-Soviet Armenia, The New National Elite and the New National Narrative. Irina was also a former deputy minister of Armenia's Ministry of Environment, and we're going to have just a short 10-12 minutes to speak with her about the environmental safety and security issues for Armenia and Artsakh. Dr. Ghaplanyan, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Salpi.
Irina Can, you've got 10, 12 minutes in which to explain the world to us. Let's start with the recent in the news environmental urgencies, beginning with Sevlij Black Lake, which is a lake shared by Artsakh and Azerbaijan, and the crisis that has developed as a result of that.
Thank you for bringing up this very important question that's now keeping our entire nation in Armenia and abroad in a very tense situation. First of all, I want to say that it's an incredible pleasure to be with such distinguished women on the same panel. And I want to actually start by saying that about 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting with Armine in Stepanakert under conditions of massive shutdowns of electricity. And I'll touch upon energy security as part of environmental security and overall human security as well, but let me come back to the issue of Sev Lake. I think what Armine spoke about, clarity, is very, very important, and clarity has to be between citizens and the government. There has to be very, very straightforward clarity in formulations of what actually is going on in Artsakh and in Armenia, and on the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This clarity has to come from governments. This clarity has to come from media. And to be very clear, Azerbaijan has invaded sovereign territory of Armenia, because Sev Lake, both during the Soviet period and in the post-Soviet period, has been almost entirely on Armenia's territory. What Azerbaijan has done is, once again, we see a very clear case of manipulation and selective approach to history. If you've been following Azerbaijani media, you might have come across that they're constantly citing a 1987 document where the Soviet ministers of Azerbaijan have designated Sev Lake, a lake which is on Armenia's territory, as part of the Garagyol Sev Lake Reserve, specially protected area. Now, they are omitting a very important part, that at the same time, simultaneously, the Soviet ministers of the Soviet Republic of Armenia had a similar decree identifying Sev Lake as part of the National State Reserve. Now, a very important factor about that is during the Soviet history, it was entirely managed by Soviet Armenian government, and all of the inspectors and the staff that worked in and around Sev Lake, which is a designated protected area under current also Armenia's legislation, was managed by Armenia. So this is another case of manipulation from a country that's a dictatorship that's been on the record for spreading misinformation. And again, we need clarity from world leaders to say what it is. And we've seen that some of the world leaders have talked about this being an invasion, but unfortunately some leadership globally is lacking to identify and clearly define of what we have a case with. And when we talk about
environmental security, right? What are the environmental security implications of this?
When we talk about environmental security, it is very important that we identify the concept of environmental security as an intrinsic part of human security. In fact, it was coined by United Nations back in, it's a relatively new term. It was officially adopted as part of the verbiage and usage in the United Nations and global vocabulary in 1994 when UNDP released its human security report, and environmental security was officially in the political discourse coined then. So environmental security is part of human security, and when we talk about environmental security, the first thing, yes, the first thing that comes, and the one of the most important aspects, is water security. And as you also mentioned in your previous episode, you had Minister Babayan speak about this. We already have a precedent when Azerbaijan engaged in the first war in contamination of water resources. We already have a case in this war when Azerbaijan engaged in large-scale destruction of natural environment. Let me recall that Azerbaijan used incendiary weapons containing what most of the experts believed to be white phosphorus. That led to, as at the time Ombudsman of Republic of Artsakh Baglarian noted, or destroyed about 2,000 hectares of forest. So we have clear cases when Azerbaijan engages in the destruction of natural environment for the purposes of war. And this is something that we need to be aware of. This is something that we need to constantly talk about, because if these very important strategic environmental natural ecosystems fall into the hands of a country that's led de facto by a dictatorship that does one thing and says another, then the security of people that feed off of that natural resource is undermined.
So we're talking about environmental security problems that are really direct consequences of political insecurity and an after-war situation. It wasn't very much different before war, but a situation really where there is no regional understanding and communication for the basic survival rights of the people in the region. We happen to be speaking about Armenians, but there are clearly Azerbaijanis for whom as well the need for regional collaboration for basic, fundamental, daily human rights is at stake. So we're talking about environmental security issues that are not a derivative of economic decisions, poor local governance. We're talking about fundamental, basic political decisions that can be made at the leadership levels in order to make life and human right accessible to the people of the region. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And another thing that's important to mention is, unfortunately, environmental damage can be very long lasting. And again, the example that I brought, the incendiary weapons that were used by Azerbaijani military during the war, most likely containing white phosphorus or another component, incendiary component. If that is white phosphorus, and if proven, unfortunately, those territories are currently under Azerbaijani occupation. But if proven that this was actually white phosphorus, it's a persistent pollutant, and there has to be a real assessment done on the possible damage to the biodiversity, to the soil, and to the water resources of the area.
The Sarsang Reservoir in the north of Artsakh, what is the situation there?
I believe that Minister Babayan has extensively talked about this during the last episode, but I want to talk about, as an extension of this, about the energy security of Artsakh. As I mentioned, I was there 2 weeks ago, and for a few hours, not a few hours actually, for almost the entire working day, electricity was shut down. The situation is quite serious, given the fact that on the territory of Artsakh there were 37 hydropower plants, of which only 8 are remaining under Armenian control. And one important fact that we need to highlight and stress is the fact that Artsakh almost entirely was feeding off of natural, renewable resources. It's something that was rarely talked about, but came up every time during different environmental conventions, because Azerbaijan would bring up the fact that they cannot gauge or inventorize their CO2 emissions because Artsakh is not part of their territory, not part of their control, and they can't gauge it. But the fun fact, if you will, was that Artsakh was entirely using hydro energy for its supply of energy resources.
The electricity cutoff that you experienced, is that a result of arbitrary decisions, or is that simply a lack of resource?
No, it's simply the fact that out of the 37 hydropower plants that were operating on the territory of Artsakh, only 8 remain on the territory under Armenia's control.
So the power sources have now diminished?
Yes.
Viken, do you want to jump in?
Yes, Irina, I want to go back to the question of Sevlij. So we are talking about water resources, and when we look at the map of the Middle East, we know that Azerbaijan in the last few summers suffered heavily from shortages of water availability. We know that the Caspian Sea levels are dropping. We know that in Iran, the Urmia Lake has practically vanished. We know that Iraq and Syria are suffering from lack of water because Turkey is not releasing enough of Euphrates and Tigris. So are we in the middle of water wars taking place in this region?
Most of the environmental experts and climate scientists are predicting that in a very near future, a future that most likely we will see and our generation will see, water as a resource will be the one for which the wars will be fought. And most of the predictions are focusing on the Middle Eastern region and this part of the world. If you were attentive enough, about 2 months ago, Iran's leader made a statement criticizing Turkey for what it was dubbed essentially politics of preying on the water resources of the region. The problem is that it is sovereign territory of Turkey where they built these massive dams, and they invested billions of dollars in the infrastructure of building these water dams. But it results in serious already droughts all across the Middle East, particularly in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So given how it is developing, I'm assuming that at some point international law will start responding to the fact that if it is your sovereign territory, you might not be able to continue doing what you're doing, because this is exactly what we're seeing Turkey is doing and affecting by default not only environmental instability, environmental insecurity, but also food insecurity by extension, and of course, by another extension, political instability in the region.
Irina, you've hit on all the high points, and again, we will continue this as a podcast conversation. But what you're saying is, in an odd way, a source of hope, because what we kept saying during the war as well was that at some point, sovereignty can't trump every kind of action that then has consequences far beyond your borders. And so possibly environmental security might be the path towards that sort of new international order. So thank you again and always for your participation.
Thank you, Selvi.
We are now, after these 3 additional crises, we're going to speak with a new kind of public intellectual. First, I'm going to invite back, of course, Viken Cheteryan and Dr. Shushan Garabedian, Deputy Director of the Institute of Armenian Studies. And together we're going to speak first to Rich Elmoyan. Rich has lived in Armenia, in San Francisco, in LA. Prior to the war, he identified a need, and I'm quoting him. He said, "Diaspora has failed in understanding Armenia's needs, military, socioeconomic, borders, which were closed. Not many understood geopolitics, how it impacts domestic and regional policies, access, railways, roads." And with his background in international relations and geography, he took to social media to provide easy, short explanations for big, complicated questions. And for that reason, we've invited him for, another short conversation to talk about his role really as an example of this new kind of public intellectual. So welcome back, Viken Cheteryan. Welcome again, Shushan Garabedian. And welcome, Rich Elmoyan.
Thank you for having me. Such an honor to be with the rest of the room.
Well, Rich, what you've done is pretty fascinating. I don't know, probably 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, if we were having this conversation, our next guest would directly be Professor Khachig Tololyan, because he is among those rare public intellectuals in the Armenian world. You and a few others in your generation, and there are a whole lot of noisemakers, I'm not sure I would call all of them public intellectuals, but you and a handful have really changed the nature of this conversation. So if you would spend, the next 10, 12 minutes with us explaining how you think COVID and the war impacted how knowledge is produced and consumed. And let's use you as an example, right? You're an Instagram personality. I call you an Instagram presenter. You have a following for things as complex as geopolitics and geography and international relations. So are you succeeding? Who's your audience?
To start off, I have independent geopolitical experience coming from San Francisco State University. However, I do utilize influencing and Instagram presenting as my main form of communication. My audience is the everyday diasporan, ranging from Australia to Canada to Armenia, even Syria and Russia. And in February and March of 2020, I utilized the opportunity of, more utilization of internet from the average civilian to my benefit. And I started to present information, for example, even Khachig Tololyan's research in transnationalism and how the diaspora fits that narrative, and trying to dissect that and, provide that information in a much more comprehensible way to the average person that may not necessarily have political science under their belt, let alone international relations. And I utilize visuals, for example, my background in geographic information systems to my benefit, utilizing the opportunities, for example, what was happening in Sevlich, where demarcation, delimitation is much needed. And understanding those concepts in a much more conversational tone, colloquial terms, for people to understand and to consume it through platforms that are commonly used, for example, Twitter, Instagram, and something as TikTok, in a way where people can consume it.
Shushan, you're muted. Okay, we got you. No, we don't have you. Making the right sounds. No. No, but just removing it won't help. You'll have to unplug it and refresh your browser. No. Aha. Whatever
Yay?
you just said, yes. Yalla. Your question for Rich.
I had a very frustrated sound. Okay, it worked.
Okay.
Rich, I was going to say this new mode of knowledge consumption and production, is it sustainable? So are you going to burn out at some point? This isn't your 8 to 5 job, right?
Or will the audience burn out?
Exactly, right? Because we hear from people that, okay, during the war, there was this thirst for information, for consumption, but now people are suffering through PTSD, vicarious PTSD, can't handle it anymore, or maybe are tired of this particular range, right? So do you think this is going to be a new trend that will be sustainable, or is it going to evolve into something else?
Well, sustainability is important, right? Because you want to make sure people are attentive for a long. And that's something, for example, when we realized in the 1990s, even though information was much less, people were engaged. People knew what their motive is, and they know what needed to be done. However, there's a gap period between that time of this I call false sense of full security, and today there's that urgency again. And essentially, it's almost like working out, and then you're not working out for a long time, and then you're back to it, and then essentially you burn out in 2 weeks, and then you don't come back to it. The form of how I'd like to see it as is for the producer of the information that's being transferred to the consumer to continue creative aspects of this way. For example, I always look at the analytics, the data analytics that suggests on Instagram through the engagement. I see exactly how many people clicked the links that I provided for them, how many people even held the link to just read it for a second. I get feedback from different people on, whether texts are better, visuals are better, and the trend is looking like in the future, visuals keep an audience longer. And the unfortunate truth is, people's attention span are sadly decreasing, and information needs to be given at a high speed, at a lower time frame. So what I'm
for very complicated topics in this case.
For very complicated issues like geopolitics in the Caucasus, understanding that, for example, Armenia has no real access to the sea unless it has to go through Georgia or Iran, or the fact that the borders are closed with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Now, understanding those concepts in a very quick manner is very difficult. So by using mediums such as Twitter, where you can create chains of messages essentially through a tweet, on Instagram, utilizing all the benefits through its algorithm as well, because not only do you have to keep your consumer, but you also have to keep the algorithm happy. That way you don't get shadowed from Instagram, what sees it as spam. So it's a very complex process that needs to be carefully executed from the producer for the consumer. And right now there's a strong demand for it, but the supply didn't arrive until, I want to say, when the war began. And that's why I started in July when the skirmish began. And I understood that this is going to be pressing. People are going to want information all at once. And therefore there needs to be this ease of information in order for people to not necessarily get bombarded immediately. And in terms of whether people can get burnt off, that's why I take the John Oliver approach of humor, satire, so people can stay engaged and they can share it with a friend in not only serious manners where they're learning, but also they're having value to it as well, in not necessarily burdening their mental health.
Viken, you're grinning. This is vocabulary that isn't generally used.
Yeah, I mean, I want to break down the knowledge production from communication to consumption, and I want to go back to knowledge production, right? And link it to the quote Salpi just made, that diaspora has failed to understand Armenia's needs. And my question to you is, where does this diaspora knowledge production take place? And why did diaspora miss to understand Armenian?
I think the lack of resources, or in this case, a lack of too many resources, and being able to identify what our resources are. For example, I utilize scholarly resources to really navigate what has happened, because a lot of the things that we're looking at is immediate time, which will go towards media, which is phenomenal in itself, right? The fact that we're able to watch videos, footages of what's happening on ground. However, it doesn't provide much of the context that has existed. For example, many of my followers, sadly, did not even know that there was a first Artsakh war in the 1990s, and various different parts of the world, wherever Armenians are, their experiences are from different places. One can be from Canada, Lebanon, Syria, and their parents may have had different ways of their upbringing. So I think the failure is not necessarily within the person, but it's within the lack of resources and identifying, what we have as a diaspora in not only mobilization, but also understanding. That's why I always, my part that I always say is, everyone has a part in this, right? Every intellectual has a part in this. And my part is teaching the geography of Armenia, understanding the importance of not only the size matter, not only the width of it, but understanding the mountainous region of it, understanding the Artsakh's, importance of the mountainous region, understanding Armenia's rivers, understanding our water resources. So those are very big factors that as Armenians, we need to be understanding from the outside as well, given that sometimes when we look at the map, we don't focus on the details. And not only that, but understanding what other countries want from Armenia and what Armenia wants from other countries, for example, the Black Sea, Persian Gulf corridor. And just bringing these ideas to the table, giving an alternative way of thinking.
Rich, going back to your statement about lack of resources, I don't know if it's as much a lack of resources or a lack of access to resources or resources being made accessible. So just a point there. And then I know I asked you this off camera yesterday and we all laughed. And I said, does your generation read books? Or does everything have to be packaged with humor, with charisma, with relatability, with a digital sexiness, right, for it to be consumed? And my question is, are the days of knowledge for knowledge's sake gone? So does every piece of information need to be sensationalized and taken to crisis mode for eyeballs to stay on your page? Is this something that intellectuals, media, thinkers, folks who are worried about kind of how knowledge is produced and consumed, is this something we should worry about?
Well, excellent point, right? Access to resources, that's a great point. And I think this generation is headed towards more visual, meaning that people consume the information when it's in front of them instead of taking the time to read it. And that just happens with the world that we live in, given the upbeat of technology. People don't have time to read that book anymore, and that's just the unfortunate truth, right? For example, in our conversation yesterday, I was mentioning sometimes I'll just search the keyword, go to that specific part of the chapter, and then I'll start from there, just to get the information from that part. And and it's not just the people; it's the algorithms of these platforms that people on a large scale. For example, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. All of them favor content that includes a face to the concept. For example, if you notice on my Instagram page, the first picture that I utilize is a picture of me, so I personalize the brand. However, the second and third one are maps. That's to fool essentially the Instagram algorithm to believe that this is just another benevolent post about me. However, it's really about the research that I'm going in depth in terms of what's in my caption. And if you look at the differences between engagement, for example, it can go from 2,000 views to only 500 if it's just words involved and not visuals per se.
Rich, this conversation deserves to go for hours because you've, I think, opened the door. But once we walk in, the problems are just going to increase, right? If you do what you were doing brilliantly, choosing the right topics, presenting them the best possible way, and getting information out there that can become knowledge. Huge, great. Usually, for the last, gazillion years, what happens next is that several people with that knowledge or aspects of it come together and further discuss in order for new ideas and paths and policies to be born. How one does that in today's social media environment is beyond me, and unfortunately we're not going to tackle that here and now, but certainly needs to be discussed because otherwise community doesn't get created, right? So there it is. Thank you for helping us ask the questions, and thank you for the answers. I hope you stay on and listen as we invite Khachig Tololyan. Khachig Tololyan is someone who basically does not require introduction. He's one of the founders of the field of diaspora studies, the founding editor of the award-winning Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, of which he was founding editor, and which he edited from 1991 to this last year. The journal continues publication, by the way, as a project of the Zorian Institute and is co-edited by doctors Talar Shahinyan and Sosi Kasparyan. Dr. Tololyan was, until this year, professor at Wesleyan University, recently retired, as we will see, given the room and the files and everything that's around him. And so we're grateful that Khachig is here today with us for the next 20 minutes or so to talk about Knowledge Nation. Professor Tololyan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity to listen to people I don't have opportunity to listen to usually.
Yeah, it's a different world, isn't it? But it's a world that you've thought about and worked in for so long. And to talk today about reimagining community, reimagining homeland diaspora relations has really got to start with you and your work in the past. And Viken, do you want to ask him the question you want to ask him, or shall I ask for you?
Yes, please. I have so many questions to Professor Tololyan. The topic of our discussion today is Knowledge Nation, and we saw that there's so much hope placed on the diaspora. My question to you is, how do we produce knowledge and how do we consume knowledge in the diaspora? What is the place of knowledge producers in our diaspora communities today?
Well, we produce knowledge in diaspora only slightly in specifically diasporic institutions. We produce it mainly in spheres that are dependent on universities. That is to say, if you ask, where do diaspora scholars produce knowledge? Where do diaspora intellectuals produce knowledge? Where do diaspora artists do what they do, which eventually amounts to producing certain kinds of knowledge? Obviously, there are different spheres, and some of them are more dependent on non-Armenian institutions than others. If you'd asked me the question 30 years ago, it would have been easier, because most Armenian-specific knowledge was produced either in Armenian language newspapers and journals, or in English language and French language publications like the Armenian Review, for example. But that has changed, it has shifted. It has shifted massively, so that what the public sphere is, where knowledge is produced, transmitted, shared, that public sphere has shifted massively to the digital public sphere. So that I am really the expert in this gathering.
Khachig, isn't part of, before I ask the question though, could I ask you not to spin your chair? Thank you.
I don't know if I can, but I'm trying.
Khachig, as part of that question, what is the role of intellectuals and intellectual work and thinking and policy strategizing within diaspora institutions? Of course, the same question can be asked of Armenia as well.
Sure. About 30 years ago, Ronald Sunni and a gentleman named Kennedy together co-edited a book. It was titled Intellectuals and the Articulation of the Nation. I contributed an article to it. And that was based on an assumption that has held true from about 1815 to until about 1975, which was that the notion of what a nation is produced not just by diplomats, leaders, generals, etc., but by those people who use language and signs in order to produce a notion of the nation. So, scholars, intellectuals, various kinds of artists, literary writers, for example, were all involved. And the question now is, what has happened first to the notion of intellectual, and second, whether the nation is still what we're talking about. For me, the difficulty in the questions that have been discussed today is not so much a difficulty of production, but a difficulty of connection. That is to say, Armenian scholars and artists working on the west coast of the United States and Armenian scholars and artists working in Armenia. How do they connect? How do you have connection? How do you have engagement? How do you have conversion? And how do these produce actual work?
Well, now we have Zoom.
Well, now we have Zoom, but Zoom doesn't produce actual work. An example that I use with my students, which is less and less available to them, is I say, look, you have engines in cars, and you have gasoline, which is energy. You burn gasoline in a car engine, and you say, we've produced energy. Energy would be the equivalent of knowledge. But in fact, energy doesn't work unless it can be converted in a car through a crankshaft or something like that to wheels that actually move the car, that actually do work. So one question is, how do you produce the gasoline of intellectual life? How do you connect it through a crankshaft to Armenia? And how do the two together move the wheels that actually has done work? And
Khachig,
it is... Yes.
To follow up on something you said before, so you talked about connection among intellectuals, but what about connection between intellectuals and the public? And sometimes I think that maybe we haven't trained our intellectuals properly to be public intellectuals. I remember very well in grad school kind of having my hand slapped and saying, your job is not to advocate, your job is not to be an activist, your job is to observe, to document, to record. Is that a failure? Or is that, academia observes and the role of I'm kind of trying to link this to Rich, right? There is a vacuum, obviously, for information that wasn't being filled, either because intellectuals didn't have the training or didn't have the new skill set and the new fluency in the new platforms where information is now being communicated.
What I would say, Shushan, is that some of what you described as intellectuals doing is really scholarship. Scholars observe, are objective, produce a certain kind of knowledge. Not every scholar is an intellectual. I would say that in my university, of the 200 or so professorial colleagues I had in the humanities and social sciences, the vast majority are scholars, many of them very fine scholars. They're not intellectuals. So there's a slide from scholar to intellectual to increasingly activist to entirely activist, political figure, etc. And the position of the intellectual in the public sphere has changed radically since the term intellectual was invented back around 1815. Today, it's certainly true that I am, in English, I'm a scholar. In Armenian, I'm an intellectual. But in neither case do I teach the wider public. That is to say, when I write in Armenian, if there's anything I do that reaches people, it reaches several thousand people who read Armenian newspapers where I publish my work. The other work, the work of reaching the very much larger Armenian public, requires a digital intellectual. And digital intellectuals like Rich Moyan are few and far between. I'm certainly not one. I'm too old, too incompetent on those media. I can't do it. So I do what I do, and other people have to do what they do. The question to ask maybe someone like Rich is, how do you produce people who know the scholarship, in his case of international relations and geography, and then manage to convert that, the energy of that, to actually reaching a wider public? My only experience with that has been in teaching a single course at Wesleyan as I was coming to retire, and it was very instructive for me. I taught about the essay, which is a genre of the intellectual, and then the video essay. When I started, I didn't know what a video essay was. My students introduced me to it, and it's only in the last 3 years that I've learned.
Viken, do you want to jump in?
My question would be, how do we link these intellectuals? Because what I understand is that we have the individual intellectuals that are scattered between the east coast of the US, west coast, Europe, Middle East, Armenia, and so on. But we are lacking the structure so that those intellectuals communicate with each other, and by communicating, maybe even develop projects and even produce knowledge within the network that we are talking about. Is this what is lacking?
And did COVID change that in any way? You, Khachig Tololyan, have been participating in online conversations, I would venture to say far more frequently over this last year and a half than you would have in person. So have we learned something from that? Does that help answer Viken's question?
I think it certainly starts answering that question. That is to say, what Zoom has made possible is irreversible. There are going to be more and more. But it's how should I say, the Zoom arena and others like it that I'm sure will develop will change the public sphere to one degree. But there needs to be other spheres. For example, let me start this way. France was a nation of between 55 and 60 million for the last 2 centuries. There were various media that any developed country has. Most of the important ideas in historiography came from one academic journal. Most of the important ideas in literature came from 2. In other words, aside from the kind of contact that Zoom makes possible, there has to be a place where you can go to where most of the intellectuals of a nation write for other intellectuals. And for me, what's lacking right now is a properly edited, I'm an editor, so I always say that, a properly edited digital journal site in which people of all intellectual persuasions can write, but not just anything they want. There needs to be an editor or an editorial board, and people filter out the chaff and put there for years and years of availability articles in which intellectuals speak to other kinds of intellectuals. You can't eliminate the need for training an intellectual elite. There are 2 issues. One is letting intellectuals and scholars teach each other, and the other is arranging the world so they can teach the public at large. The second part is incredibly important. It's just that it's not something I can contribute to. So I haven't thought very much about that. That has to be done digitally. I think even introducing intellectuals to each other has to be done digitally from now on. Digitally doesn't mean just with pictures and sound. It means with words available that can be, where an article can be recalled and searched at any time. I think we need to move on those fronts together.
Khachig, during the war and after the war, but in the context of the war, what did Homeland and Diaspora learn about each other?
I hope what they learned is that the homeland state is both extremely important and cannot be helped by the diaspora beyond a certain point. The homeland state had to act. It acted not very competently, and we lost. But there is not much that I can imagine the diaspora to have done in the situation we were in. That is to say, people raised money, people expressed ideas, but we were not in a situation where suddenly thousands of young Armenians could say, volunteer to go and fight and actually do so usefully instead of merely sacrificially. So the notion of, I am very much, as you know, Southie, a believer in the potential of the diaspora. But that's not a potential that can be summoned forth on a dime. It's actually something that has to develop and be made permanent. And it's never developed permanently. The way in which cross-border engagement happens depends on structures that are fairly permanent. There has to be continually the possibility of diaspora scholars, intellectuals, activists to present ideas, to present information, to engage in disputation and argument with homeland intellectuals and officials, so that out of the continuation of that, something happens. I think sudden, momentary explosions of diaspora enthusiasm cannot help Armenia in moments of crisis like the Artsakh war. They could help more perhaps in the COVID situation, but I don't know that they did. I don't know that they did.
So Crisis Nation ain't going to cut it. Just Crisis Nation ain't going to cut it. So cannot.
I mean, you can be helpful in the crisis if you've already constructed the apparatus that moves quickly into action during the crisis.
So to repeat what you said earlier in different words, during the war, I'm not sure the diaspora could have done much to change the outcome, you said. But that does not mean that prior to the war or after the war, the diaspora cannot.
Right on both counts, right. But it has to be sustained, it has to be long-term. I think about other diasporas and homelands, and since the famous case is always Israel, yes, the Jewish diaspora was able to help Israel. How? Well, initially, it provided money for the purchase of arms and even of World War II surplus airplanes to be sent to the emerging state of Israel in the wars of 47, 48. Now, in the first when Karabakh was first initiated, there are rumors that I've never been able to fully check up on that wealthy Armenians from Lebanon and Greece were able to provide funds for the purchase of weapons for Karabakh. To this day, I don't know if that's true, how true, and how effective was it in that struggle. But it's pretty clear that the majority of the assistance from outside Karabakh came from Levon Petrosyan's government, not from the diaspora. We were not set up to do that.
So, Viken and Shushan, we have 5 minutes left. You each get a real quick question, and Khachig gets a real quick answer.
Okay, I'll go first. Khachig, how do you think COVID and the war changed homeland diaspora engagement, the nature of the engagement, the media that were used, whether that was a transition from institutional to more informal, personal? Do you think, one, there has been a substantial change, and what will that look like?
Well, the substantial change is what Salfi already mentioned. It's the creation of the Zoom sphere, of the digital sphere, which I think will be here from now on, and constant consultation will happen. But I think that there's a danger in the convenience and likability of the sphere in which we're meeting each other, which is that you need these more permanent bonds, institutional and other, between diaspora and homeland. And I'm afraid that the homeland, especially the institutions, will be shunted aside because people will say, well, if I want to talk to Khachig or Salfi, I can get on Zoom or whatever and talk to them. So the making permanent of continual exchange of information, opinion, analysis may be shunted aside. That's my worry.
Viken?
My question is, what do we need to do in the diaspora to help Armenia and Karabakh in this new post-war reality?
Simple question.
I think, again, that not so much COVID, but COVID also, and the war above all, showed how important the state is. Even in the United States, the failure of response to COVID was a failure of response of the state. The Trump government did not fully mobilize the resources of the U.S., but because the U.S. has such a highly developed private sphere, the private sphere stepped up and did a lot. President Trump's advocate would say he did one very important thing, and that's true. He poured billions of dollars into the corporations for quick research and innovation in finding a response to COVID. We in the diaspora have always to be ready to pour money quickly into identifiable problems if they can be fixed with money. However, the disaster of the war, the catastrophe of the war, the failure of the war could not, in the best of conditions, have been solved by diaspora money. It could not have been solved simply by diaspora ideas, although my feeling is that the defense officials and government officials of Armenia were incredibly ill-informed about things like, for example, drone developments. And that might have come to them if diaspora specialists in these things had continually been consulted with them. So I think continual consultation, not dismissal but engagement with the opinions and knowledge of scholars and intellectuals is what we have to sustain above all, a sustainable communication system between diaspora groups and homeland government. And
I would like to put that in big red neon letters: sustainable communication methods. If you can, sitting at CivilNet, I can't say enough about how important that communication process is. Sustainable communication, Armenian diaspora, sustainable communication within diaspora, amongst intellectuals in public, and all the rest of it. The worst part of this job is to say, sorry, we got to go. Khachig, you got 10 seconds. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Yes, we need to develop contacts, not just that way, and not just with the American University of Armenia. I want to see contact with things like the Polytechnic School. I want to see contact with Yerevan State.
Done.
I want to see contact with Yerevan.
Registered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Khachig Tololyan, Shushan Garabedian, Viken Cheterian. And thank you to all of you who've been following. Please come back this Friday as we talk about digital nation and how that sphere has changed and can continue to change community, homeland, diaspora relations. All of this is available on all YouTube, Facebook, and podcast channels. Thank you for following the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies.